I'm Ed Rabyd, otherwise known as the Rabyd Atheist, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Feel free to like or dislike the video as you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I'd appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like. The purpose of this channel is educational in regards to atheist and deconversion issues, and any other issue related to those issues, such as politics, Bible theology, philosophy, etc. I also want to give a shout out to the Rabyd Nation. Welcome, and for those of you that want to be part of the Rabyd Nation, shout out to you. Today I'm doing a little bit different video because I am stepping out of my expertise a little bit, other than I have a lot of experiences as a pastor with this type of personality inside the church, and that's the sociopath. Now, I want to caution everybody, I am not a psychologist, I'm not a counselor, I'm not an expert in various diagnoses of mental illnesses or anything like that. The problem is that I also want to point out to people that sociopaths are drawn to certain situations. And I was talking with somebody the other day who is an expert in those fields and said that, there's a lot of different professions and different places that sociopaths are drawn to. And one of the top places that sociopaths are drawn to is church. And this is kind of why I want to do this video really, hopefully quickly, mostly just looking at what I think is some of the experiences that I've had while I was a minister with sociopaths. The first thing about sociopaths that I learned by more experience and actually studying about them is almost all of them are in some way charming, some way humorous, or they know how to break down people's walls and gain their trust. Okay, they don't. You have to understand that inside the church, it's very easy to do this, because all you have to really do is be kind of a funny, very superficially open person to talking to people, making jokes. And the idea is to build people's trust. A sociopath has a bigger thing in mind, but they're dealing with more of a, trying to find a way to get in with every person, to know what every person's weaknesses are. You trust them enough to open up to them after a while, and then they use what they learn about you against you. I've had probably a sociopath, at least one, if not two, in every one of my churches that I pastored. And now you need to understand, a lot of sociopaths don't go to the point where they're, killing people and putting people in their basement. Most of the time, they're just manipulative, and they're bored because they're usually highly intelligent. And they get bored easily with stuff, so they kind of play with people. It's kind of, the level of somebody's meanness as being a sociopath really depends. Some of them are very low level, some of them are higher level, and most of the ones in the church, I would say, are low, medium level. But the one thing that you can count on is they're very charming. They're very, well-liked, well-loved, often charismatic. And some of them occupy the pulpits, but in my case, I was in the pulpit, so I usually had to deal with them in positions of power because that's what they were. The other trait of them is they're narcissistic. There's always seemed to be that guy in every one of my churches that felt that they were right, okay, and that no matter what you told them, no matter how you talked to them, they were right. And religion feeds into this because we have this notion that we have the truth, okay? And a person can really attach themselves to those beliefs, and by doing so, people that watch them or look at them also attach themselves to those beliefs, will gravitate towards the sociopath because this person seems to be a champion of what the truth is, and they don't compromise it. They believe that they're right. I've had plenty of people that no matter what I showed them in the Bible, no matter what I showed them in anything, they would gravitate towards that. They would sit there and say, this is what I think. Almost all of them had, this is what we should do in the church, and everybody else should agree with me. And they often move themselves into positions of power where they had influence on the church and its decision-making processes. And what this does is it allows them to kind of, you know, massage things in their direction. They're not overtly smashing power. The other part of a sociopath is they are pathological liars. Now, there's levels of pathological lying. Some of them, you know, I never met a sociopath in any of my churches that wasn't a little bit of a braggart. They would talk about their accomplishments. They would talk about their stuff. Every one of them, in my opinion, had a persona that they put on when they walked in the church, but they were a completely different person away from the church. You don't really find that out until later. That's kind of your first sign that you might be dealing with a sociopath half the time. But I had one person that was, you know, very friendly, outgoing, a real champion of moral rightness. And then, you know, Monday through Friday, you know, it's particularly Friday, maybe Saturday, they were out with the boys playing poker, getting drunk, you know, doing all the things that Christians aren't supposed to do. And then they would come in on Sunday and be holier than thou. And that was pretty typical of most of the sociopaths I dealt with. They're manipulative and they're cunning. None of these people are stupid. And that's the danger of the sociopath, is how smart they are. They get to know you real well because they're so friendly. You don't have a problem opening up to them. But they usually use that to find your weakness. And then later on, when they're trying to manipulate you, they'll use what they know about you to get what they want. And to them, I think it's kind of a game. The reason they manipulate is not so much that they are deliberately necessarily trying to be harmful, although they end up doing that, is it's a game to them. They're bored. They're very intelligent. And so often sociopaths just, you know, they're looking for where people's weaknesses are, and then they exploit those weaknesses. They don't have very deep emotions. I never really saw any of my sociopaths tear up, per se, or get upset to the point of, you know, feeling real, genuine empathy. One of the things about sociopaths you need to realize is they have very shallow emotions. They don't have any remorse, shame, or guilt. I never met a sociopath that would talk about one of their mistakes. They would never admit that they made a mistake. And they never seemed to be guilty about what they did. I would talk about, well, that's kind of shitty what you just did to that person. And they're like, well, you know, well. And it's like they had no empathy. This is probably the biggest problem with sociopaths, is as far as human empathy, they just didn't seem to have any. You know, I had one guy that, well, you know, that's their fault because they took this and this action. And it's like, if they hadn't said this to me, and I'm like, well, you didn't need to respond. It doesn't matter. They shouldn't have said this. I had another guy who, you know, one of his main things was, you know, I do everything for my own entertainment. And you need to understand, when you take that to your logical conclusion, you know, it's fun to have fun with people and banter and all that stuff. But when you go low and go after them really with, you know, something hard or mean, you know, it's just rude. It's mean. But they don't have any shame, remorse, or guilt about it. They're like, oh, well, you know, they'll get over it. I also saw one guy that just, you know, he said something to a couple in my church, knowing what kind of couple they were, because they got afraid easily. They were very paranoid. And he fed into their paranoia all the time, and thought it was a lark. He just thought it was funny. Incapable of human attachment. I think this is the best way to describe it. They just don't seem to have sometimes seem to have a lot of friends, but they don't seem to have anybody that's a deep friend. They might be able to pull off one or two good, solid relationships, but the rest of it seems to be a revolving door. Genuine relationships are very difficult for them. It's often more superficial. Sure, they can know a lot about you, and you can know a lot about them, They seem to sometimes have trouble having romantic relationships, but I don't think that that's necessarily always the case. Uh, they form relationships in order to appear normal, but they don't really have any real feelings about that relation. Remember, this is the biggest problem with sociopaths is a lack of empathy. They don't really have real empathy. They can fake it. They can lie about it. They're often good actors. Um, so they can pretend to have these good relationships, but they just don't attach. Inside the church, I saw this all the time. It explains, and religion kind of feeds into this because it explains how you can have somebody who's a dear member of the church, but the moment they do something that is against the taboos of the church or they head to the door, all of a sudden these people, oh, I never liked them anyway, and I don't want to have anything to do with them now because they're off, doing bad moral things, and I don't want to attach myself to that. Um, I knew several people that seemed to have this revolving door of relationships. That as long as the relationships served their purposes, and this is the real danger of a sociopath is whatever their purposes are, as long as a relationship served their purpose and did things for them, they were very happy with the relationship. And so, those that were in political power in the church often had these people that were they were their fans, they were their fanboys and girls, and they just followed them around. And they would often, use those relationships and what they knew about that person to get votes or whatever. My last church, one of the guys, that was a sociopath, he had like two people on the church board that always voted what he wanted. So it was like there was no, and he was just, as long as they served that purpose. In my last church, once I no longer served that individual's purpose, he discarded me fairly easily. There was no human attachment. Once you are deemed by the sociopath to no longer be of use to them, they'll get rid of you. And that happened to me, and that's when I really realized that my suspicions that the person was a sociopath were true. They have a constant need for stimulation, and this reflects in the churches. You ever notice that the same people that want power and manipulate it also seem to be the ones that point out all the problems? They get bored, and so they'll poke fun of somebody. They need some sort of gratification, and they can, I don't know. I have a bunch of people. It's interesting that most of my sociopaths, some of them were in what would be considered dangerous occupations, such as being a police officer or, something. They had hobbies that put them on the edge. It's just strange to me that they're just there for the thrill. They're thrill seekers, and it's strangely, and then they want to pat themselves on the back for being how brave they are, and then they use that to manipulate people as well. I've already kind of gone over the lack of empathy, but I want to point out one other thing about lack of empathy. I remember watching several of my sociopaths over the years hear sad stories, and they would kind of nod. It's really hard to get a sociopath to tear up unless they're a good actor and they're acting it. They don't seem to feel anything, and you can't really measure that. You just kind of watch them, and they just don't seem to give a shit. And it's just a basic that. They can be impulsive, but not necessarily. Some sociopaths are actually very, very controlled, and in how they express themselves, and so they just seem to have this notion that they can kind of do stuff to keep things going. I knew one that was probably short-tempered, but he never let it get out of hand, so they couldn't be identified as somebody with an anger problem. Instead, he would get mad, internalize it, and then he would find a way to manipulate the person he was mad at in order to get back at them. If you didn't toe the line with this guy, he would find a way to, really dig you in the ribs, and so to speak, and then twist the knife. Not all sociopaths have poor behavior controls, but it can be there. A lot of my sociopaths seem to be a little impulsive, but not all of them. It's not necessarily a trait. One of the other common signs that people talk about with sociopaths is they have promiscuous sexual behavior and rampant infidelity. As a pastor, I didn't always see this. The truth of the matter is, people are actually probably pretty good at hiding improper relationships. I am fairly certain there's a lot of people that have very improper sexual behavior relationships in the church. It's just they never get caught at it. I'm fairly certain that some people went to their grave, probably having several mistresses or, backdoor boys, and nobody ever knew. It's interesting to me, for instance, like how the Catholic Church seems to always get these, playing with the altar boys, or their, nuns playing, footsie with, their female or male students, things like that. And you have to ask yourself a question, okay, how much doesn't get caught? And I think sociopaths love the church because there's great ways not to get caught. There's great ways to keep going forward behavior. Oh, you got to forgive that behavior. Or, we don't have, like with the Jehovah Witnesses, or they don't have 2 or 3 witnesses, so they don't report sexual misconduct to the police. It's kind of these things that turn me off to the church anymore, because every time I go into a church, I see signs that people are a little bit sociopathic. And I think religion feeds into this, because you're taught to pull yourself away from somebody that is not part of the faith. You're taught to, be a person that just does whatever you need to do to keep your faith, even if that means breaking relationships, even if that means manipulating, even if that means lying. I think religion kicks the empathy out of you over time, because when you're trying to be obedient to the commandments of God, it's very difficult to sit there and always be empathic to a person who's really going through something. And so I think the church and religion in general kind of kicks all that out you, and it's a fertile ground not only for sociopaths to come in and take advantage of it, but there's a little bit of a breeding ground for it. Some of the people I knew that grew up in the church, and now are still in the church, I would consider very sociopathic. And, it might be the religion that did that to them. I can't say that definitively for certain. Like I said, I'm not an expert on these things, and I'm just speaking as a former minister who seemed to always deal with this kind of sociopathic behavior, this lack of empathy, this manipulative nonsense, this just people that found a way to know stuff about you and then use it to their advantage to get what they wanted. It was a game to them, and they always seemed to be bored, so they would stir up trouble just to have more things to do and more things to manipulate. And I really think that a church is a fertile ground for it. So one of the implications of this for me is I really don't like going to church, even for family functions. Because I'll walk in and I'll start looking around, and all the things kind of glare at me anymore. And if I run into any church leaders or people, a quick conversation will realize, man, geez, you just don't really give a shit about other people unless they're part of your tribe. And that kind of seems to be built in. Thanks for stopping by. Once again, I'm no expert, I'm no psychologist or anything, but this has been my experience over the years of dealing with sociopaths, and some of my thoughts on how I think religion and church in general kind of really generates this sociopathic nature. And it's why I continue to work for people's deconversion, because since leaving the church, I've always been empathic to a great extent as a pastor, and I learned how to be better and more empathic as a pastor. But since leaving the church, I actually feel like that whole influence is gone in my life. And I feel like in a lot of ways, I really am much more concerned with people's well-being in a genuine sense, instead of just trying to figure out how I can utilize that to navigate the waters of the church. Now it's more of how can I genuinely help. And so that's kind of where I'm at with that. And I wanted to talk about it. And I'm interested in all of your thoughts as well, because I think it's important. Some of you have come out of church and maybe you've noticed certain behaviors that seem to be very similar to this. So just kind of looking for a little bit of discussion to see what would happen there. Once again, thanks you for stopping by. Please like, share, and this video, subscribe. Every little bit you do helps the channel, and the channel is continuing to grow slowly again. But for a while there, we were doing pretty well, but now we're growing slowly again. There's always something that triggers or happens that causes a channel to have these bursts of growth. But it all really comes down to you. So thank you very much. You're free to follow me on Facebook as well. It's the best way to personally message me or get announcements about the channel. So it's one of those places that you follow my Facebook page, you'll be a little bit more informed. Of course, you're also welcome to support the channel on PayPal or Patreon. The links to that are in the description. So thank you very much for doing that. I have 3 patrons. To all 3 of you, thank you very much. I appreciate your support. You've raised the financial support to a point where there's a fee that I pay to do things. Well, that's now a wash. You guys pay the money in, I pay the money out, and it's a zero-sum game pretty much. So that's one thing that I've done to keep the channel going, and now it's paid for. So thank you very much. Once again, thanks for stopping by, and hopefully I can convince you to be a rabid atheist like myself. In the meantime, this is Rabyd, also known as the Rabid Atheist, signing off and wishing you a good day.